All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's 3 o'clock briefing. Science disrupts the sex trade, aiding victims, blocking buyers. We have 3 speakers and also a distinguished guest today at our briefing. Our first speaker is Michael Pullman, a research associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Robert Beiser, the strategic initiatives director for sex trafficking at Polaris. Amanda Hightower, executive director of the Real Escape from the Sex Trade here in Seattle. And the organizer of the briefing is here in our front row, Barbara Mack. She's a retired judge and a member of the board of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. She will be available to answer questions during Q&A. So we'll go ahead and get started hearing from our speakers, and then we'll open it up for your questions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Here to talk a little bit about our research that we're going to be presenting tomorrow. Commercially sexually exploited children in Washington State's child welfare system have lives, can you hear me? Have lives that are characterized by residential instability, running away, and frequent and repeated contact with the justice system, largely for crimes related to survival. We have an in-press paper that's going to be coming out in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect soon, and it's the first examination of the residential and juvenile justice placements for children identified as sex trafficked in the United States who are living in foster care. Now, so we know that children in foster care are at a much greater risk of sex trafficking than children in the general population. They share a lot of risk factors, the abuse, trauma, neglect, parent instability, parental substance use. And in recent years, federal and state policy has shifted such that child welfare is now becoming increasingly responsible for identifying and addressing the needs of these youth, as opposed to juvenile justice. And we also have the opportunity, big data lends us the opportunity to analyze their entire lives. So we have an entire lifetime administrative records from juvenile justice and child welfare on youth who have been sex trafficked. So we can look at patterns in their residential placements and in their contact with the justice system. So in Washington State, in King County, we obtained data on 83 youth that were identified as being highly likely to have been or confirmed to have been sex trafficked. And we linked their juvenile justice and juvenile courts and child welfare data. And what we found was that these youth experienced, as I mentioned earlier, just drastic and exaggerated residential instability. So on average, 27 living situation disruptions. So meaning they're changing from one place to another 27 times. That could be running away, going back to a foster home, going into a crisis stabilization unit and going back to the same foster home. Those would be like 4 placement disruptions. They were living in any placement before, it was only about 2 months between disruptions in any living situation. So imagine when you were 15, having your living situation disrupted every 2 months. 9 out of 10 of them had at least one runaway episode, and of those that had a runaway episode, they had an average of 9. About 75% of them were placed in juvenile detention at least once, and of those who were placed in juvenile detention, they had an average of, again, about 9 placements in juvenile detention. In fact, they had about 2.5 months of their lives were spent on average in juvenile detention. And, as I mentioned earlier, the most common placement situation, the most common living situation for them to have was actually on the streets. They spent more of their days on the streets than in any other single type of living situation while they were in the care of child welfare. When youth had contact with the juvenile justice system, as I mentioned earlier, it was largely for survival crimes. So it was shoplifting, fighting, and running away. This led us to argue that running away is both a symptom and a cause of child sexual exploitation, and therefore offers a really nice intervention point for the system. And we really argue in our paper for specialized foster homes that use evidence-based practices to make sure that youth can stay stably housed in their placements, or if they do run away, that those placements are available for them to come back, and that we can have foster parents that are specially trained to prevent and intervene early to prevent runaway behavior.
So I'm Robert Beiser. I currently work at Polaris as the Strategic Initiatives Director for Sex Trafficking, but previously I was the Executive Director of Seattle Against Slavery here in Seattle in King County. In 2014, Seattle Against Slavery began work on utilizing technology to achieve some of the goals of our organization to both more rapidly and effectively connect survivors of sex trafficking with needed services, and also to disrupt those who were exploiting sex trafficking victims through online sexual exploitation. This began initially by learning from survivors, service providers, and law enforcement about the marketplace for commercial sex trafficking online and how buyers of trafficked sex were reaching it, which was simply using Google and Bing search engines, searching for things like young prostitute, young escort, prostitutes tonight. They would be connected with websites where trafficking was taking place. And so Seattle Against Slavery began utilizing a series of ads with the same types of keywords that we saw connected to sites where sex trafficking was happening in order to run pro-social ads dissuading people from buying trafficked sex. These included harm revelations, so describing the situations around trafficking that victims were experiencing, consequences for arrest and prosecution, which in Washington State includes being a registered sex offender, becoming a felon if one is caught attempting to buy sex from a minor or having bought sex from a minor or trafficking victim, and also alternatives, support, education, and counseling that was available for people who were sex buyers, who were doing this habitually and wanted support being able to stop. What we discovered with those search ads was that if the volume of the search ads was significant enough, and we had in some periods of time above 10% of the keyword searches around buying sex from trafficking victims in our area, we could significantly alter the rate of click-through to other types of ads and also reduce the number of searches for terms related to sex trafficking. So over the period from 2014 to 2016, we compared this with searches for those same keywords in other cities. We then had some statisticians, because we were nonprofit anti-trafficking people and not statisticians, help us with developing sort of trend analysis of where these keyword search trends were going. And we were able to confidently say, in comparison to many other cities in the United States with statistical significance, that running search ads that simply offer alternatives to buying sex from a potential trafficking victim would decrease the rate that people were searching for trafficked sex online. We then attempted to enhance this effect by creating a chatbot based on technology through Microsoft's Azure platform using the LUIS, Language Understanding Intelligence Service, that would mimic a trafficking victim if a sex buyer reached one of those ads. Again, in collaboration with trafficking survivors, service providers, and law enforcement, we walked through what the conversations would look like when buyers were buying trafficked sex. And we tested out whether or not similar types of deterrence messages to the ads that we had run at online ads would cause buyers to reduce the rate that they were attempting to buy sex from potential trafficking victims online. So we ran a control group of ads, captured all of the phone numbers that people texted to those control group that did not have a deterrence message. We then ran the experimental group that had a deterrence message, similar types of deterrence messages, harm, consequences, and alternatives. And we found that in 19,000 interactions or conversations with 14,000 unique phone numbers, that there was a 31% reduction in recurrence of buyer appearance between people who had received deterrence messages and people who had not. So we again learned, in addition to the ability to reduce sex buyers searching for potentially trafficked sex online with Google or Bing search ads, we could also reduce the rate that they would contact ads for commercial sex that could be trafficking victims by sending out simple text message deterrence. The third area that we got into, because Seattle Against Slavery also was doing work related to connecting victims with survivor services, was creating a technology platform that would allow for service providers who provided support services to survivors of trafficking to reach out via text message to potential trafficking victims in their area who were being posted online in these same sites for commercial sex where we had placed the decoy ads. And what we found through that type of intervention was simply on a high level that it was possible to connect trafficking victims with local services in their area by sending them text messages and allowing service providers to have one-on-one text conversations through targeted outreach to potential victims. And we can share a bit more about what the statistics are, but under that, one of the lead service providers who helped us with the development of that victim outreach platform was Real Escape from the Sex Trade.
Good segue. My name is Amanda. I'm co-founder and executive director of REST, or Real Escape from the Sex Trade, here in Seattle. We are a local organization providing outreach and a full continuum of services to victims and survivors of sex trafficking. And we began 10 years ago specifically with street-based outreach to potential victims of sex trafficking. And over a 4-year period, we engaged with 624 individuals. And out of that group of individuals, 26 of them engaged in services, so moved from an initial conversation on the streets to actual service of rest outside of outreach, another day, another time, and a different type of service. Between the years of 2012 and 2015, we saw a drastic decrease in the level of street-based prostitution happening as the marketplace for buying and selling sex was moving online. And so we wanted to pursue a different approach to outreach, digital outreach. And as Robert mentioned, we partnered with Seattle Against Slavery and volunteers from Microsoft to help inform the text outreach project and began to implement victim reach out through Freedom Signal. And so I want to compare a second 4-year period, the first 4 years doing street outreach, and then a second 4-year period utilizing text outreach. We sent out text to over 10,000 unique phone numbers, with each phone number representing a potential victim of trafficking. And we engaged in conversations, the initial connection, with 428 of the individuals who responded to text outreach. And 95 of them engaged in services at rest as a result of those efforts, which was a 22% engagement rate. This comparison indicates that victims of sex trafficking are 4 times more likely to progress from an initial conversation into services when the outreach is done via text rather than in person on the streets. We asked survivors to tell us why. Why does text outreach work better? And they had several reasons. First, they can respond at any time with text outreach. They have the information and they have the phone number, and they can respond when it's easiest for them, during their off hours, or perhaps when their trafficker isn't observing them, when it's safer. They also described having a greater sense of control and equity in the conversation, and that the gradual move from a text message to perhaps a phone conversation and then an in-person meeting is less intimidating than approaching somebody in person on the streets. Ultimately, though, because text message is the most common form of exchange in the commercial sex industry, the familiarity of it made it possible to open a door to building trust through relatable text messages. Furthermore, when we have the person initiating victim reach out who identifies as a survivor or somebody with lived experience of sex trafficking, it also increases the ability to build trust and relate and advance from an initial conversation over text into services. The year after we launched text outreach, we saw a 70% increase in the number of individuals engaging with REST for services. And the following 2 years saw additional increases around 40%. we know then that text outreach is just clearly a more efficient way and more effective way to not only reach survivors, but then help them to progress into services if that's what they're looking for. And we look forward to continuing to see that develop.
Thank you. Okay, so we can take questions now from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you, and kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Hi, Janet Ray Dupree, freelance. Can you give me some examples of what you mean by decoy ads and interference ads? I wasn't quite understanding what it was you were presenting people who did these types of searches.
Sure. So that's actually, in your question, there's two different types of ads. So a search ad would be the type of response that you would see in Google if you searched for, lawnmower in Seattle. You would get a list of places that would sell lawnmowers, list of websites where people were talking about lawnmowers. That similarly occurs when people search for, young escorts or young prostitutes. You'll get a list of people talking about that topic and then a list of places that you can go to find that thing that you're looking to purchase. So the ads were simply a response to those. Those weren't decoy ads. So if you see in a list of ranked Google or Bing ad responses, there are some at the top that'll usually say ad next to them. It was just a promoted ad that would say things like buying sex from a minor could further the cycle of human trafficking and result in you becoming a registered sex offender. So it just gives them a direct sort of line of information. Or the harms of trafficking are created in large part by sex buyers and their support of traffickers. Or if you are struggling with a sex buying habit and want support, here are alternatives and resources that are available. And then it would link them to other types of websites. With the decoy ads, the vast majority of online sex purchase happens in a sort of classified ad type of marketplace. And so it's literally like a Craigslist ad that describes features of the person who is being sold for sex and where you can contact them. Sometimes it's describing explicit services, but in large part, it's not quite as transparent, the specifics of the services that people will buy. So there's terminology and slang that's used instead. And most of the conversation that gets down into specifics happens after buyers initiate contact with a person that they want to buy for sex. So in these ads, they simply paralleled ads that trafficking victims had been placed in themselves. So these survivors that we talked with, they said, here are the things that would be listed in the ads when I was trafficked. We would repeat those similar types of ads in online classified ads with a phone number. So the purpose in the decoy ads was to allow buyers to engage with someone who they don't know if that is a person who is a trafficking victim, a person who is law enforcement who's seeking to arrest them, some sort of, and this was a thing that came up with a number of buyer forums, some sort of information gathering tool that would try to steal their credit card information or give them malware, things like that, or in a certain set, a person who was an adult who is making the decision to be involved in commercial sex. So within that sphere, buyers really have no idea who the person is that they're contacting. So in this case, we wanted to increase the level of awareness that it could be law enforcement, that it could be a trafficking victim, or that it could be an avenue for them to get support with their sex buying habit, and at the same time remove some of that level of anonymity that there were people in these places where sex trafficking was happening who were attempting to dissuade buyers from supporting sex trafficking by contacting these ads.
Question here in the second row.
Sarah Napton from the Telegraph in London. It's a similar question actually, but more about what Chatbots were saying. Could you sort of talk about what a conversation might have sounded like? And just second question, is this the normal web or the dark web?
This is the normal web. So for sex trafficking to reach the level of prevalence and proliferation that it has, you can't have a lot of barriers or stop gates. It needs to be relatively easily accessible by sex buyers. And so they're not logging in, doing a lot of verification of their identity in order to get past safeguards. They're simply searching online and finding classified ads. The conversations were fairly pedestrian, like most forms of commerce. It was, where can I buy this thing that I want to buy? How much will these different services cost? When can I get them? And can I pay more for these type of particulars? The chatbot was able to be successful, I think in large part as successful as it was because the conversations are not complicated. In the same way that a person doing sales can get a script for most of the questions that they're going to be asked and what the responses should be, this chatbot was able to understand what the questions were fairly quickly, and then we had a pretty deliberative set of responses that would say, I'm this age, so sometimes the chatbots were set to be adults, sometimes were set to be minors, sometimes set to be ambiguous. I'm in this location, I offer these services for this price, always initiated and pushed forward by the buyers themselves, so the chatbots were responsive. And then at some point, when the chatbots were determining a level of intent. So it could be someone who simply just likes contacting ads like this because that's fun for them and not getting into the specifics. But when there was a certain level of intent, then the chatbot would issue the deterrence message, or for the control group of chatbots, they would go silent.
So you all have had a lot of success here in Seattle using the digital interventions to get victims to reach social services. What would it look like? What would the trajectory be, or what would some of the challenges be to scale this up to more national level effect?
I can speak to the technology more, but Amanda probably could speak to the more critical issue, which would be the services that would be required in order to need the technology.
Yes, one of the biggest challenges with scaling is ensuring that if we are sending reach out messages, we also have the capacity to respond when victims request assistance. And it's really important that we aren't just sending text messages out without the ability to follow through, because it decreases the likelihood that a victim might reach out again in the future. And so there's the steps of identifying providers throughout the country who are not only equipped to provide a quality response to victims of trafficking, but also have the capacity to engage in outreach and respond to an increase in people who might reach out for services.
Just as a ballpark of unique phone numbers in 2019 that could represent a potential trafficking victim, there were roughly 250,000, over 250,000 unique phone numbers just in the US. If you see, as we did in the Seattle area, a 10% response rate, and it's roughly 8 to 12% in different areas of the country, that represents 25,000 people requesting services, which would be overwhelming for any organization to handle. And if you look at the capacity that's available for housing, for counseling programs, for substance abuse support, legal services, even placement within a child welfare system, that's an extremely large number of people who are going to have complex and long-term needs. And so the technology needs partners. And for folks who want to follow up more with the technology providers, Freedom Signal is the name of the software service, and it's run by Seattle Against Slavery, and you can contact them for further questions. But for Freedom Signal to be successful, it needs an underpinning of the support that people would be connected to.
I'll add one more thing to that. Another technology project that is starting to get in motion will contribute to a scale of Freedom Signal, and that project is to deploy a chatbot with service providers to learn about available services and current inventory levels of services. And so that will give us insight on different locations around the country that might have an increase of available services, so then we could do outreach, targeted outreach into those areas to connect survivors to those services.
Michael, your research points to the importance of preventing children in foster homes from running away. And you talked about needing specialized training for foster parents and families. What does that look like? How would that be different than the training they're getting now?
Yeah, sure. So this training, I think, could be based on something called multidimensional treatment foster care, which is an evidence-based practice that's been used with both girls and boys who are prone to running away, who may or may not be sex trafficked. I think the sex trafficking component would add, obviously, information for the foster caregiver around elements of sex trafficking, how to identify specific red flags, and how to talk to their foster kid about these issues. And I think there's a bigger issue, though, which was more of a policy issue in Washington State and in many other states. If foster care homes are so limited that if a foster child runs away and if they're gone a certain number of days, that place where they're staying may be taken up by another child. So when they find that foster child, they no longer can live in the same foster home that they were at before. And it's that sort of stability that we know is really essential, especially for youth who are trafficked. And so by the policy itself is creating more of instability, and so these specialized homes. I would hope that in general we would be able to create policy where foster homes would be open to any youth who are running away, but in particular for these homes that may be specialized for youth who are sex trafficked, we'd want to make sure that they have a place to return to when they're done running.
Question here? Yeah.
Sorry. You had mentioned using big data, and in some of your presentation materials, you had mentioned artificial intelligence. In what way are you guys using AI? Is it true AI, or is it more deep data analysis?
Yeah, the AI is really more on the Robert's side, I would guess. I don't know if the chatbots count as AI, but in terms of the stuff I'm doing is more deep data analysis. And some things we didn't talk about, we have a new data set and we're looking at patterns of these living situations. So ideally we can identify if there's specific subtypes. In fact, we already think there may be one, which is youth who are involved in the foster care system very early for a few years of their lives, and then seem to sort of disappear for a while, and then emerge again when they turn around 13 or 14 years old. About 20 to 25% of the youth in our sample seem to fall into that pattern, and those are the youth for whom we may need to pay some extra special attention to. But that's the type of deep data analysis that we're going to be sort of getting to in later steps. In terms of AI, again, I'll defer to Robert.
And I would say for the applications that Seattle Against Slavery was using with Freedom Signal, it is built on true AI, but it is not creating its own native artificial intelligence. So the language understanding that's required to interpret the responses from the buyers is AI. It is a part of Microsoft's language learning engines that over time starts to learn the difference between the word W-A-T and the word W-H-A-T, that people are not intending to talk about a Buddhist Wat when they are saying Wat. And initially when all of that is fed in, computers get very confused. So in that language understanding intelligence service, it is taking application feedback and being able to learn what different types of terminology or slang has meanings that it previously corresponded with sort of dictionary language. The other thing that it does is contextual analysis. So it can understand, this was a problem that came up with one of our first applications. If you ask someone their name and then the person says back a word that could be another word, can't think of an example off the top of my head. Say a person is named Tree. That because you've asked them their name and then the word that you get back has a capital T, tree, they're not talking about the object that's a tree, they're giving you their name. And so that type of contextual analysis also falls into the category of AI. I would say for the people who are doing like dynamic machine learning, AI, this to them is not the type of research stuff that they're getting into, but they can see that the practical applications down the line of being able to understand context better, being able to generate responses based on context, and being able to understand irregularities in speech patterns that establish different sorts of patterns for understanding in the future. These are the type of applications where that comes forward in understanding what people are going to be saying when they're sending text messages back and forth.
Was there any hesitancy, or is there, in the social services community, to use technology? And have social services professionals been surprised by the effects it's had in bringing victims to them?
I think in my experience, there tends to be a hesitancy to engage in new technologies or more than one technology for social service providers. And I don't think it's been surprising to learn that innovative approaches are increasing engagement or are showing to be more effective. And yet there's still an uphill battle with trying to inspire and make it easier for social service providers to connect. And one of the pieces to that puzzle is to ensure that we have as many kinks in the technology worked out before we start introducing more service providers to it, so that they find it to be user-friendly and that it immediately connects with their needs. So, for example, if we're able to tell the story of a freedom signal in terms of victim reach out, if we look at efficiency for street outreach, based on the numbers that I provided earlier, 60 hours average of outreach per one person, one survivor engaging in services. For digital outreach, it's just 6 hours. It's a drastic increase in efficiency, and that will then, I think, help service providers be interested and willing to log into a new platform to use it. But we just want to make sure it's easy to bring them along. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all. That was extremely insightful. We appreciate it. If anyone has follow-up questions for our speakers today, I think they could be available. There's also a separate room across the hall, 208. But thank you again, everyone, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.